Okay, so the next part of this lesson has us finding the midpoint, locating the midpoint on a coordinate plane. So this box at the top here talks about the midpoint formula and how to use it. So it states, the coordinates of the midpoint of a segment are the averages of the x-coordinates and of the y-coordinates of the end points. So if I have a segment that has endpoints A and B with these coordinates, the way I find the midpoint is what I call the average of the x values, the average of the y values. So essentially I'm getting out a point, an xy coordinate pair. So I take my x values, add them together, take that result, divide it by 2, and I do the same for the y values. So in example 3, we are finding the midpoint of a segment. So in order to do that, I take P and R to find that midpoint. I'm going to show my work here. The midpoint would be me taking -2 and 4, the x values, dividing that by 2. Then me taking 5 and 3, the y values, adding those together and dividing by 2. And then I just work on simplifying. And I can do some mental math. -2 plus 4 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So that's me taking the x value, simplifying this first expression here. For the second expression, the y value, I take 5 plus 3, which is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So the midpoint of that segment is 1, 4. And I know I show it on here, 1, 4, but you need to be able to find it mathematically without the aid of that graph. Now that graph is nice, and it helps us count, but I really do want you to be able to find it mathematically, okay? So the next part of this example, what it does is it gives us the midpoint. It gives us the midpoint and endpoint. It then has us find the other endpoint. So we've got a little bit of extra work to do there. So to find that other endpoint, we've got to think of this as kind of like an equation, okay? So to find that endpoint, x, y, I'm going to use my midpoint formula. So I'm going to take the x value of one of my endpoints, x, the one I don't know, plus the x value of the other endpoint, which is 1. I get that from here, okay? Divide that by 2, and set that equal to the x value of my midpoint. So I'm finding x values throughout this whole process, all right? So for me to solve this equation, I would multiply both sides by 2. That's a 1. So I would have x plus 1 equals 6, and then I would subtract 1 from both sides. So in that case, x is 5. So that's one of my values for my endpoint. So for the y value of the endpoint, I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to use the y value of the endpoint I don't know, coming from there. I'm going to add on the y value of the endpoint I do know, 6, divide that by 2, and set that equal to the y value of the midpoint. So we're working kind of backwards here, all right, to find those values. So this becomes y plus 6 equals 2 times 4 is 8. Y equals, if I subtract 6 from both sides, y is 2. So my final solution here is point C. And I can tell from this that point C is the point 5, 1. And I understand that I could count that right here, 5, 1. But I really want, again, I want you to be able to find the midpoint mathematically. I want you to be able to find the end point mathematically. So it's not enough to get x and get y. You need to be able to represent it as a point. That's very important, okay? So here's a good spot to stop. Work through the got it questions, 3 and 4. Wait a second, and then I'll show my solutions, and I'll explain my solutions. So here's my work. I'm just showing how I set it up. I took, for number 3, I took the average, -8 plus 2, divided that by 2. So that's -6. That's how I got -3. For the y value of the midpoint, -1 and +4, added those together, divided by 2, I got 3/2. If you got 1.5, it's the same thing, okay? So it's just using that formula, recreating that formula, right? Next. As far as midpoint, endpoint for number 4, we are finding the other endpoint. So a lot like before, and I color-coded this to keep it clear. I was taking m for the midpoint, x for the endpoint. In my equation, I'm using -3 and 6 to find my x value of my endpoint. So that means x plus -3, x being my missing endpoint, -3 being my known endpoint. For the x values, divided by 2 equals 6. Solving that, multiply 2 by both sides, and then added 3 to both sides. Then I moved ahead and I took the y values. Y, my unknown y value of my endpoint, plus 7 divided by 2 equals the y value of my midpoint. And I solved that equation. So you're setting up equations with your x values and y values of your midpoints and endpoints. You're getting out the other endpoint. So essentially just a little illustration of that is you've got one point, you know the midpoint, you're trying to find the other endpoint. So let's just say this is known, this is known, this is what you're trying to find, this endpoint, okay? Before we were finding the midpoint. Now, in these types of problems, we're finding the endpoint. So move ahead, get a little practice with this because the next formula we're gonna learn is a little more in depth. So it's important that you practice this and get a good understanding so that you can move on to the next step in the lesson.